Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots is the cousin of Elizabeth and was the Queen of Scotland. She was the daughter of King James V of Scotland and his French wife Mary of Guise. Scotland and his French wife Mary of Guise. Her relation to the Tudors. Mary was related to the Tudors. Her grandmother was Margaret Tudor, Henry's 8th older sister. Margaret Tudor had married King James V of Scotland, and her son was Mary's father, James V. Henry VIII was thus her great uncle, and she and Elizabeth were cousins. So Mary of Scots is the cousin of Queen Elizabeth I of England. Henry VIII wished to have baby Mary as a future bride for his infant son Edward, and in 1544 his forces invaded Scotland in an attempt to force this matter, but he failed. If you remember that we said that the regent during Edward's reign, Duke of Somerset, has sent an expedition to Scotland because the Scots refused the marriage of, or the engagement of, Mary of Scots to Edward VI. What here we are talking about is before the expedition sent to Scotland, Henry VIII himself has also sent his forces to Scotland. In fact, Mary of Scots was sent to France to marry the Dauphin Francis, the eldest son of King of France, later Francis II. Her mother, Mary of Guise, acted as a regent in Scotland. So, when Mary of Scots was a teenager, she was not living in Scotland. She was in France because she lived there and then married Dauphin Francis, the eldest son of the King of France. In 1559, the King of France was killed in jousting accident, and at only 17 years of age, Mary became Queen of France. So now Mary of Scots, is the Queen of France. Of course, this alarmed Elizabeth, who had only just become queen herself, as she had. Her government feared that the French would now try and claim the English throne as well. Why would the French claim the English throne? Because, as we said before, that Mary of Scots is related to the Tudors, She's the cousin of Elizabeth. So, probably the Catholics would believe that Mary of Scots is the one who should rule England, not Elizabeth I. The French were simply not in a position to do this, however. Mary of Guise's position in Scotland was weak. The mother of Mary of Scots, we said that she is the regent in Scotland. She's the one ruling Scotland, because Mary of Scots is in France. So Mary of Guise, she was fighting for survival in a country that was now Protestant. Scotland is Protestant and Mary of Guise is Catholic. Her daughter Mary of Scots is Catholic. Take care that both the mother and her daughter are called Mary, The French could not think of attacking England when French rule in country via Mary, and her mother was so fragile, meaning so weak. For this reason, Elizabeth's ministers urged her to aid the Scots against their Catholic government. So, the ministers of Elizabeth wanted her to help the Scots, in order to change their government, which is ruled by the regent Mary of Guise. Elizabeth was reluctant to aid rebels, meaning that she didn't want to help them. But in the name of self-preservation, in order to protect herself, she agreed actually to help the Scots in their rebellion against the regent Mary of Guise. English involvement was rather disastrous, however, with the English forces suffering humiliating defeat. The people she sent to help the rebels were defeated. William Cecil was sent to Scotland to negotiate peace with the Scots, and he played a prominent part in drawing up a treaty with the Scottish government, which guaranteed peace between two realms. So now there is a peace treaty between the English and the Scots. What was it called? It was called the Treaty of Edinburgh. This is very important, the Treaty of Edinburgh, which calls for a peaceful relationship between Scotland and England. Okay, this treaty was never ratified by Mary, meaning it was not signed by Mary of Scots. However, she refused to relinquish her claim to the English throne that the English requested. Also in this treaty, the English have written that Mary of Scots should not claim the throne of England, meaning that she should not ask to rule England. Mary was always seen as a considerable threat to Elizabeth, a huge threat. Many Catholics did not recognize Elizabeth as the true queen of the realm. They did not recognize the marriage of her mother, Anne Boleyn, to her father, meaning Henry VIII, and so believed that she was illegitimate. So the Catholics here in England do not like Elizabeth because she is Protestant and her mother is Anne Boleyn, the reason why Henry VIII has changed the religion of the country from Catholicism to Protestantism. So, for many years, Catholics plotted to depose, to get rid of, and kill Elizabeth in order to put Mary of the Scots on her throne. Mary herself did not recognize Elizabeth as the true queen and believed that she herself was the rightful queen of England. So Mary of Scots also believed that she should hold the throne. Not only her Catholic public or people, no, but she also believed that she must rule England. The relationship between Mary and Elizabeth was always very difficult. As mutual queens and cousins, they tried to keep up a pretense, a show of friendship, but in reality they did not like each other very much. Perhaps because she was 9 years older than Mary, Elizabeth always treated Mary with care and was remarkably tolerant of her less than respectful cousin. Not long after Francis died, no longer really welcome in France, Mary soon returned to Scotland. Mary soon returned to Scotland. Her return was much needed as her mother, Mary of Guise, had died in 1560. In 1561, Mary arrived at the port of Leith, and as only a few people know of her coming, she was greeted by only a few of her lords. Because she was still refusing to sign the Treaty of Edinburgh, Elizabeth denied her cousin passage through England, and so Mary had bravely sailed the distance from Calais to Leith directly. So here, because Mary of Scots was no longer welcomed in France, she returns to her home country, Scotland, to rule Scotland, especially that her mother, the regent, Mary of Guise, died. So in order to reach Scotland, she should pass through England, but since she refused to sign the Treaty of Edinburgh, Elizabeth refused to allow her passage through England, and so Mary went through another way until she reached Leith. But the news of her arrival soon reached her people, the Scottish, and they gathered in crowds to welcome the return of their long-absent sovereign. So people welcomed Mary of Scots in her home country, Scotland. Scotland was very different to France, and Mary found her native country rather disappointing. She had been away most of her life and had been brought up in the wealth and splendor in France. Scotland lacked France's wealth and glory, and it was also much colder, so there's a difference between France and Scotland, different backgrounds. And Mary, because since she was a child, she was raised in France and married in France, she was not used to the society present in Scotland. The country was also Protestant. Mary tried her best to govern Scotland well and initially was successful. She was tolerant of Protestants, though she was a devout Catholic, but she was tolerant of Protestants, listened to the advice given to her by her various ministers, and kept at peace with her influential Protestant half-brother James Stuart, later Earl of Moray, illegitimate son of her father James V. Now moving on to the relationship between England and Spain, we said that they were to some extent in a relationship that is apprehensive, that something might come out, that there were no misgivings. But when Elizabeth refused to marry Philip II of Spain, people on both sides were afraid that there might be a war between the two countries. Moving back to the relationship between Elizabeth and Mary of Scots, now that Mary was a widow, people were beginning to ask who she would marry. As with Elizabeth, her marriage was of immense political importance. It concerned the English government greatly. Elizabeth feared that she would marry a very powerful prince who could help her raise an army to invade England. So it's important to know who Mary of Scots is going to marry. The same case when it was important to know who Elizabeth I was going to marry. Elizabeth wanted Mary to marry a man with very little power or influence, so that her Scottish cousin would be less of a threat. Elizabeth was afraid that if Mary of Scots marries a powerful leader or a powerful person, or maybe a prince or a king, that they are going to attack England and claim the English throne. This is why she was afraid. Perhaps with this in mind, Elizabeth offered her Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Had Mary accepted the offer and Elizabeth agreed to it, Dudley would have found resistance virtually impossible. But to his relief, the negotiations fell through. Lucky for Robert Dudley is that Mary refused this proposal, because if she didn't refuse, he would have to accept, because he would not do anything but obey Queen Elizabeth I. So the next suitor for Mary of Scots is Lord Henry Darnley, an English Catholic cousin to Mary, who also had a claim to the English throne, was permitted by Elizabeth to travel with his father to Scotland, and Mary, attracted by his person and position, decided to marry him. So now Mary of Scots has agreed to marry her cousin Lord Henry Darnley. Of course, Elizabeth was outraged. Elizabeth was very angry because now both of them could claim the English throne and become the rulers of both Scotland and England. With their joint claim to her throne, Elizabeth feared that they would have substantial support for trying to depose her. However, this marriage was miserable. It was Mary's life that Darnley made more miserable. Their marriage was certainly not a happy one. Perhaps the only benefit of it was the birth of Mary's only son, James, in 1564. And by the way, he's going to be the next king of England after the death of Elizabeth I. However, it was said that Lord Henry Dudley died in his house because his house exploded. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, was accused of murdering Lord Henry Dudley, and he was accused because Mary of Scots and James Hepburn were in a secret relationship. And Mary confirmed the suspicion against James Hepburn by marrying him after the death of her second husband, Lord Henry Dudley, because her first husband was the Dauphin Francis. This was the beginning of the end of her reign in Scotland. Her people were outraged that she had married the man suspected of murdering her husband. In the streets, they called her all sorts of names, and soon people were calling for her abdication as monarch. People in Scotland wanted Mary of Scots to leave the throne to her son, that she should no longer be a queen. Mary's army met that of her enemies at Carryberry Hill, but when she saw the magnitude of the opposition, she surrendered without even putting up a fight. She refused to fight her people. She was taken as a prisoner and she was coerced to sign the abdication papers. The Scots forced her to sign papers saying that she is no longer the Queen of Scotland and that her infant son was King James VI of Scotland. And of course she had to sign those papers. A careful plan was made to free Mary from captivity. She was guided out of the castle by a 16-year-old page, Willie Douglas. He has set her free. Mary was provided with a horse and rode for her life and freedom. She then rose another army, but was defeated at the Battle of Langside. So she was an able woman. She rose an army in order to fight back and to claim her Scottish throne again, but she was defeated at the Battle of Langside. Mary helplessly fled to England. She ran away for her life. She had few friends and many enemies, and even her European supporters had turned against her. Even her friends in Europe did not help her. She besieged Elizabeth to help her. She asked for Elizabeth's help. This was a very difficult time for Elizabeth. She had always feared Mary's power and influence, but the deposition and disgrace of a fellow monarch frightened her more. She was afraid that people would catch up with Mary of Scots and kill her, and this was not something good for a queen to be deposed and to be killed. If they could treat one queen like this, then they could so easily treat another one that way too. Elizabeth took Mary under her protection, but in reality she was little more than a prisoner. So Elizabeth agreed to help Mary of Scots, okay? And actually she was more than a prisoner than a free person. Many people wanted Mary dead, but Elizabeth would not hear of executing her cousin and fellow monarch, and refused all requests of releasing her so that her enemies could kill her. The English people, the people close to Elizabeth, the people in the parliament, believed that Mary of Scots is a threat to Elizabeth, and they wanted her dead, and they wanted Elizabeth to have her executed, but she refused to execute a queen and at the same time her cousin. Mary owed her life to Elizabeth, but still the relationship between the two queens was difficult. Mary soon resented being kept a captive, a prisoner in England, and longed to be restored to the Scottish throne and gain the English. So, despite the fact that Elizabeth helped Mary of Scots was bored of being a prisoner, and she wanted to return back to her country, to Scotland, and be the ruler once again, and also not only to be the ruler of Scotland, but also to claim the English throne, though Elizabeth has helped her. For the next 20 years, there were attempts to release Mary from her prison and make her Queen of England. Elizabeth's counsellors continued to urge her to have the Scottish Queen executed, but Elizabeth resisted them. So 20 years, Mary of Scots has been kept like a prisoner for 20 years in England, despite the attempts to have her killed in order to make sure that Elizabeth I is safe. The next important point we're going to discuss is Babington plot. And Babington plot was in 1586. This date is very important, 1586. It was not until the Babington plot of 1586 that Elizabeth finally relented, and only then because there was proof of Mary's complicity. Elizabeth was hurt and angry that Mary had personally endorsed her murder when for almost 20 years she had protected Mary's life. So the Babington plot was a conspiracy agreed on with Mary of Scots to depose Elizabeth and kill her and make Mary of Scots the Queen of England. So when Elizabeth learned about this plot, she was very angry because she has protected Mary for 20 years. However, actually the plan was of Sir Anthony Babington. This is why the plot is called Babington, because the person who made up that plan is called Sir Anthony Babington. Sir Anthony Babington and his co-conspirators planned to release Mary from the house at Chartley where she was kept and to depose and kill Elizabeth. Their plans failed, however, as Sir Francis Walsingham, one of Elizabeth's most influential ministers, had created a very effective spy network that monitored the actions of English Catholics by using double agents and spies. Thanks to Sir Francis Walsingham, one of the ministers of Elizabeth, who had created a very effective spy network, that he was able to monitor the actions of the English Catholics, so he was aware of the steps of the conspirators. Anthony Babington and his supporters were tortured and put to death, and Mary was put on trial. Of course, this is the normal result after having discovered this plot, is for Anthony Babington and his supporters to be tortured and then killed, and Mary to be put on trial. Of course, she was found guilty of treason and condemned to death. But despite this judgment by Elizabeth's judges, Elizabeth could not bring herself to sign her cousin's death warrant. Of course, when there's an execution, the Queen should sign the papers saying that she agrees upon this execution in order to be carried out, but Elizabeth could not do that. Still, Mary of Scots is her cousin and is a fellow queen, so this is a hard step for her to take. The very thought of executing a crowned sovereign terrified her, and the whole matter affected her health profoundly. Elizabeth's health was affected by what was going on, and that she has to take the decision to sign the death warrant of Mary. In the end, she reluctantly signed the warrant. Her ministers secretly rushed through the execution, and Elizabeth was not told until it was over. Mary was executed in 1587. So after she signed, Elizabeth's ministers and judges did not tell her about the day when the execution is going to be carried out, because they were afraid that she would change her mind and would not allow the execution to take place. Elizabeth's fury was tremendous. Elizabeth was very angry after she has known that her ministers had finally carried out the execution. She had her private secretary, William Davidson, arrested and turned against those of her council who had taken part in the execution, even her old trusted servant, William Cecil. She threatened to have Davidson hanged, saying that she never intended the execution to take place, only to use the warrant as a threat to stop Mary from taking part in such activities again. So here Elizabeth said to her ministers that she signed the warrant, but she didn't mean for it to take place. She was just threatening those people who were going to try to call Mary of Scots and try to free her and try to depose Elizabeth. And her reaction was that her reaction was severe, that she had her private secretary arrested, and she was saying that she was going to execute him, and even her counselor William Cecil, who she depended upon, also was threatened by her. But in the end, her anger receded, and in time she was reunited with Cecil. Davidson was released from imprisonment, but was never returned to his post as secretary. And this is the end of Mary of Scots. Is an important character in the history of England. You are supposed to write a short note about Mary of Scots, focusing on the main points we have discussed.